Welcome to the Talent Development Hotseat. I am your host, Andy Storch, and I'm excited that you're joining me today for another great episode and conversation to help you up your game and improve your capabilities in the world of talent development. And today we are talking all about leadership development and helping your managers succeed. My guest today is an expert on the subject. Vic Smith is a professional certified coach, skilled facilitator, leadership development consultant, podcast host, and experienced talent development professional. She combines deep expertise in leader and manager development with best-in-class relationship building and communication skills. With over 25 years of experience, Vic has led leader development at Nike, Google, and Amazon, three massive brands that we all know. And she has taken her learnings and built Whistlesmith, a leadership development consultancy focused on building stronger leaders. Vic, that's a lot. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here. It's always like slightly uncomfortable when someone reads your intro, and like you get this kind of run of your bio. It's like, oh, okay. Hi.
Yeah, but you have, and I want to talk about the work that you're doing now, but really you have worked at some of these highly, not just recognized brands, but where I would expect there's a lot of attraction of great talent and pressure to develop and grow talent so that they can continue to innovate and create a lot of success for the organizations. So what was it like when you first got into talent development in the beginning?
So I first got into talent development, probably like kind of early 20s. I was working in retail, and I remember having this moment. I was doing a regional role where I was, kind of managing a few different stores. And I remember thinking, I don't want to be doing this when I'm 40. And at the time, 40 felt so far away. It's now in the rearview mirror, but And I was like, I don't want to be doing this when I'm 40. What do I want to do? And so, I looked at what are the things that bring me energy? What am I good at? And I was good at the coaching and the developing and leaving things better than I found them. And I was like, well, what might I make a career from? And, at the time it was learning and development. And so I went and got a few certificates with the CIPD, the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development, out of the UK, because I'm British, and that was the recognised body. And then I just started working on different programs and different populations, and just found I really enjoyed it and really liked it. And I think at the time it was very traditional. It was, hey, we want to train someone on how to do a performance review or how to interview a candidate. And I think the shift in the process-driven training to the human skills in terms of, how we connect with our teams, how we connect with employees in the organization and understand what motivates them and what makes them tick, and, how to be an effective leader, I think is super different now than it was then.
Yeah. And you eventually got a job with Nike, right? And
I
moved.
did.
I saw you lived in a few different countries working there.
I did, yeah. I got a job with Nike. Actually, I talk about this a lot. I feel like I grew up at Nike in terms of, being a talent development professional. It was an awesome organization to work for, and without a doubt still is. I worked with incredible people there. A lot of them still work there. Many have moved on. They're connections you make for life. But I think when you have a brand like Nike where it's so purpose-driven, and it's, kind of cool and everybody wants to work there. You kind of get this desire to want to be the best you can be in the field you're in. And so the kind of talent development piece, leadership development piece, for the large majority of the time was quite easy because you're pushing on an open door. Employees want it, leaders want it. We understand the investment, right up to the board. They understand the drive of culture against kind of productivity, against business profitability.
And what did you learn, obviously working in this high performance culture, but also living and working in different countries throughout that time as well?
Yeah, so when I got the role, I was living in London, in the UK, and then I moved to Amsterdam and worked out of their European headquarters in Hilversum for for about kind of 5 years, and then moved from there. Anytime you work at Nike, if you want to kind of move up and progress, all roads lead to Beaverton, to Portland, Oregon. Like
Right.
you kind of, that's where you eventually migrate.
Right.
And then I moved there for 5 years and worked there until I moved on. But I think, seeing the difference between European working culture and US working culture, very different. And so there was a huge adjustment of style there, in terms of, in Europe, you come into work and you get going. And in the US, you would come into work and spend the first like 30, 40 minutes talking about what you did the night before, talking about like your weekend. And I
Yeah.
remember thinking, is this like wasted time? And it wasn't. It's like building relationships, and that's how a lot of the work gets done. Through those relationships that you build and those connections you make. And so a lot of adjustment,
Yeah. It's kind of interesting. So what did you learn throughout that time with Nike, obviously being high performance growth company, from what I understand, investing a lot in the development of its people. So what did you learn from the approach that Nike leadership took toward investing in the development of people there?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. I think that one of the key learnings I took from Nike was the power of investing in building a culture that drives performance, and the power that the manager has in an organization. And I think that, when we talk about leadership, we're talking about two different pieces. We're talking about the senior leadership in an organization that kind of sets the strategy, sets the culture, and then kind of drives. And then you're talking about managers, kind of people managers, that are bringing that culture to life and setting the daily climate for their teams. And there has to be a tight connection between both. Otherwise, senior leadership is, espousing values that managers aren't leading through day to day, kind of for the employee experience. And I think that, one of the great things about Nike is that there was never any discussion of should we invest or not. It was more about how much should we invest and what should we invest it in. And that, I'm fortunate. That's a really fortunate place to be in when you think about where a lot of organizations are right now in terms of development budgets,
Yeah. And how did that compare with, I know you spent time after that at Google and Amazon, not as much time, but these are more tech forward startup type companies, even though they're massive at this point. And at least based on what I hear, don't always invest as much in learning and development as a company like Nike would.
Yeah, and I think I don't know. It's not necessarily about they don't invest as much. I think the investment looks different.
Okay.
And so, if you take Google, they have an immense internal network where Googlers teach other Googlers how to do things. And so there's a lot of kind of cross sharing of information, sharing of ways to do things. They have a great internal manager community and a great internal coach community. So they do a lot of work from within. And this is, how kind of Google was founded, in terms of, this entrepreneur spirit of, I don't know how to do this thing. I'm going to go and find out how to do
Figure
it.
it out. Yeah.
Yeah, and so there's this almost culture of figuring it out, and this culture of spending time doing something else as well as your day job that makes you both better at your day job, but also better as a human.
Right.
And so
and Google also being famous for things like Project Oxygen, where they said,
Yes.
hey, we're going to figure out how to make our leaders
Yes.
better so that we can implement that.
Yes, absolutely. Like, they're kind of famed from, do we even need managers? That kind of that piece of it. And, at my time there, we looked at, one of the things we did was we updated the Project Oxygen work in terms of, because that was, well, like 10, 12 years ago now. And so, kind of what does that look like now in the environment and the kind of, the culture that we currently have at Google? Because when you first start an organization, you create this set of values, you create this culture that builds with the organization. But the more people you bring in from the outside, in lieu of there being a really strong culture, people make their own and bring their own. And so there's just this like beautiful melting pot of new and old coming together to create, this kind of new way forward.
Yeah, it brings up an interesting question because I know you worked on culture at Nike. You've worked in at least 3 organizations with pretty strong, famous cultures. There's a lot of talk out there about what defines a culture. How do you shift a culture? I'm curious what your perspective is on that. Like what ultimately defines a culture, and how can that be shifted over time, or can it be changed?
So I think like culture is defined by how we do things around here, not how we say we do things around here. And I think that's often the disconnect in organizations. You might get a poster on the wall that tells you what the values are here, but if they're not lived every day, they just become a poster on the wall, right? And I think that what I've seen in those 3 big brands is that it's the day-to-day way that we make decisions. It's the day-to-day way that we collaborate. It's the day-to-day way that we think about the consumer or the end user that actually drives the culture. And I think that you can change culture, but you're not turning a speedboat around. You're turning around a great big tanker, right? Like I often work with organizations and they're like, we want to change the culture and we want it to be done by Q3.
Yeah.
And it's like, I mean, we can try, but let's be realistic. If you're in an organization of 25, 50 people, you could do that by Q3. But the more individuals you have, the more influence you're trying to make. You're trying to change the way that things are done around here. And I think that when you're trying to do that at scale, it's doable and it's a great undertaking. But it's something that takes time. We worked on managers at Nike. We ran a project called Manager Excellence, which was around building world-class managers. And that took us 4 years. It took us 4 years to shift the way that managers operate, because it's ingrained in everything. It's ingrained in how you hire them. It's ingrained in how onboarding looks. It's ingrained in the training and the messages that they're constantly receiving. When you roll out a big change, how you engage your managers drives how they help their teams to navigate the change. And if you're not investing in that space at all, then that's going to feel bumpy and rough for employees.
Yeah. Speaking of that, as I've done my own research and had lots of conversations over the years, I completely agree what you're saying about culture. And oftentimes strategy and culture is, of course, translated, communicated, defined, and role modeled by managers, right? Leaders, both senior and in the middle and even on the front line. I know you spent a lot of your career, especially in the later years, working on manager development, developing managers. One of the biggest challenges, of course, in all of corporate talent development is promoting people from IC to manager and then them not having the proper training, right? What have you seen as far as the biggest mistakes that companies make in developing leaders? And I'd love to get into some of the best practices as well.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things here. And one is my biggest advice for organizations is if you can get ahead of that promotion, or you can get ahead of the individual contributor becoming a manager, that's the place to do it, like before they even become a manager. So how do you help them to understand what's required, what their expectations are? How do you get them upskilled to a place where they feel confident heading into a conversation with someone on their team about anything? Not just, a performance conversation or a compensation conversation, but a setting goals or coaching conversations. Like how do you do that up front? Because the minute they step into the manager role, regardless of whether they've done it before, there's an expectation that their team in the organization has of them, that they will do something specific that often when they're moving from an IC into a manager role, they don't know what that expectation is. And so that's kind of what I see as one of the biggest challenges. And then I think one of the other mistakes I see a lot of organizations make is if they get that right, if they do train in either kind of before or there's development on the job, it's focused on the processes. Like, what does the performance management process look like? What does the hiring process look like? What buttons am I pressing in the system? And I think whilst that is important and quite frankly broadly interesting, it's it's not the important piece. The important piece is, how do you have a human to human conversation about
Hmm.
someone's performance? How do you build trust? How do you
Hmm.
demonstrate empathy? Like, what does that look like? And I think a lot of organizations miss the mark in the thing that they're training managers on. If you train someone on how to have a great, meaningful conversation, they can apply those skills in any conversation you're then asking them to have.
Hmm.
But what we do is we say, here's how you have a performance conversation, or here's how you have a compensation conversation. Versus, if you can have a really great conversation and show up as a human and recognize the person is also showing up as a human and you're in this together, then you
Hmm.
can talk about anything because you have that skill set. And I
Yeah.
think we often miss that.
Yeah. So many organizations, just about everyone is investing in building, revamping, updating, running leadership development programs, right? Because everybody
Yeah.
understands that we need to, most companies and leaders understand we need to invest time in developing our managers, our leaders, because they're the ones translating the culture and the strategy and driving performance. What do you see organizations get wrong when it comes to leadership development, or the mistakes they make? And what's the best approach to developing or creating a new leadership development program?
I'm so glad you asked. Um, I think I think one of the mistakes that we make is that we're doing things the way that we've always done them, and so
Mm,
we are using outdated methods to try to drive behavior change. And so, if you're making an investment in leadership development, you're doing it because you want something to be different. And oftentimes, the way that we approach that from an organization perspective is, we invest in, let's say, a 2-day or a 3-day training. We pull people off the job, we saturate them with content, and then we send them back and we expect everything to have changed. And then when we come back in a month's time and nothing's changed, we want to know why, and it becomes the manager's fault or the
mhm,
leader's fault because they haven't put into practice what we asked them to. But in actual fact, the forgetting curve tells us that you forget, 60% of what you've learned within 24 hours. And so, this idea that you're expecting 3 days of content to translate to something different in the day to day, I think 10 or 15 years ago, when we didn't have the research and the knowledge and the information that we do now, that felt like the best way to do it. But it really isn't. And across my career, what I've seen is organizations try to do it this way time and time again. This definition of insanity, doing the same thing time and
mhm.
time again, expecting
Yeah.
a different result. And one of the things that we do at Whistlesmith is, we've taken that information, that kind of all those data points that I gathered over the last kind of 20, 25 years. And we've created the Manager Lab, which is, founded on this ecosystem that is about, how do you assess what the skill is that you're trying to build? Then how do you provide learning in a way that suits the learner of your organization? And for
Mhm.
some, that is, a half day or a day off the floor. They're kind of learning whatever it is, and then we're heading back on the floor. But the difference with the Manager Lab is that as they do that, we have this practice portion. And we partner with First 90, who are a behavioral change
Mm,
organization. And they have app-based technology that allows you to do digital daily micro learning
yeah.
that reinforces and has you practice and apply what you've learned in the kind of development moment, whether that be, sometimes we'll do a 2-hour skill lab that focuses on one skill,
Mhm.
and then they'll practice that for 30 days through action, through community, through kind of extra content. And that it gives this opportunity to try a few new things, but keeps that learning front of mind. And then we
Mhm.
bring all that together with communities. Like, how do you do learning at scale? And this is a way for us, both the assessment, the kind of learn portion, the practice, and community. Like, how do we do it at scale? How do we develop best practices? And I learned this piece from Google in terms of the manager community, that when you have a really strong manager or leader community, there is a way for the organization to tap in and either get a temperature check, share what a new process is, share a new expectation, or have that group share best practices, which puts less pressure on the
Yeah.
support functions to have all the answers.
Right. Yeah. So what I'm hearing is one of the biggest things missing for most leadership development programs is the opportunity to actually practice to reinforce that learning, right? It's you put people in a room to learn concepts, but unless they go practice, which is something that, I've been involved with a lot in the past, having worked in a business simulation company where you met
Yes.
Paul, right, who
Yeah.
founded First 90. And I know Paul, I forgot to mention, he connected us, and I interviewed him on this podcast many years ago. It's still one of our most downloaded, listened to interviews with
Yeah.
Paul Middleton, talking about using micro learning to reinforce learning for leadership development. So I love that you're using that. So giving people an opportunity to practice and reinforce that learning, which is difficult because more and more there's pressure to, not take managers
Yeah.
or leaders out of work, right? And just have them watch a micro learning session or something like that.
Yeah. And I think like the piece for me here is, how do you affect behavior change? How do you build different habits? And a lot of the research tells us that you build a habit by doing something repeatedly. And this is why the learning path that follows whatever the learning intervention is, the practice portion, is 30 days or more, because doing something for 30 days is almost like the sweet spot of being able to change your thinking about it and your mindset about it. And one of the great things about this partnership with First 90 is, because it's app-based technology, there's a lot of data that we gather. And so let's say, for instance, we're asking a specific question around the topic we're dealing with. Let's say it's having a meaningful conversation. And we ask everybody in the cohort the same question. And we recognize that everybody in the cohort is answering that question in a way we'd rather they didn't. Right? Not like a wrong way, because I don't know there's ever a wrong or a right way, but they're asking it in a way that shows a mindset or a thinking within our manager population that we want to change. That's a data point for us to be able to say, hey, here's something that you all answered this one way. And, we would rather that it shows us where else we can lean in and kind of train or change or develop managers to think in a different way. And, I think when we do learning in a way where we pull them off, we, train them on something, we send them back out, we lose all that interaction, that data points, we lose those insights.
Yeah. You've been in this space of talent development and leadership development for several years now. What do you think has changed in terms of leadership, and how would you define what I like to call modern leadership, the way that people need to be leading in 2026 and beyond?
Yeah, I think there are so many changes. I think there's a couple of things. And one is, I think the rate at which the world is changing is way faster than it was 10 or 15 years ago. And so I think the nature of leading people is constantly evolving. I think the age of AI is a huge influence and will continue to be. And I feel like AI is a little bit like digital was 10 or 15 years ago, where we were like, oh, we need to know what, we need to train people on digital, but we didn't actually define what digital was. And I think what I'm seeing now is people say we need to train on AI without really understanding that this isn't training on how to use AI, like how to ask AI the right questions. It's
Right.
how AI is changing the landscape. And I think that, we used to ask managers to lead their people, to coach their people, to kind of set clear direction. And now I think we're asking them to do so many other things. And I work with, I partner on a lot of projects with Dr. Andre Martin. And he talks about how, we used to ask managers to do these three things, and now we're asking them to be a cheerleader, to be a counselor, to be a kind of a police person. We're asking them to fight some fires. We're literally asking them to do so many other things that we're not in any way developing them for. We're just expecting them to figure it out. And the socio-political climate that we're currently operating in, our employees can no longer leave their stuff at the door as they come into the into the workplace. And I think 10 or 15 years ago, that's what we were asking them to do. And there's no way they can now. Their work lives, home lives, the way that the world works now and will continue to means there's no differentiation between those things anymore. And so I think from a leadership perspective, what we are asking from our people leaders is so much more than we used to. And I think every organization needs to make it a strategic imperative to invest in this space to allow them to be able to meet the needs and the expectations.
Yeah, I agree. You know that I'm very passionate about career development and
Yes.
teaching people to take ownership of their careers. I've been on that mission for several years now to teach people to be more intentional and proactive with their own careers. But owning your career doesn't mean you can do it all on your own. You need support
Correct.
from your manager to have success in the organization you work for. So one of the keys there is leaders and managers supporting their people in owning their careers, which involves having coaching conversations. I feel like there's a lack of that
Yes.
going on in a lot of places. How do we teach and encourage our managers, our leaders, how to support their people in developing in their careers? Because it's the number one reason now people leave organizations is
Yes.
lack of perceived career growth. So
Mm-hmm.
we need our leaders to support people and just having those conversations to find out what they want to do and where they want to go.
Yeah. I think the first thing that we need to do is we need to set the expectation with people leaders that this is what we expect from them. And so that their role is to help their teams think about their careers. And, I don't want to brush over the fact that, you recently released a book on
Mhm.
this that is phenomenal in terms of laying out what it means to own your career, right? And
Mhm.
kind of laying out what the components of that look like and what the support should look like and all of those things. And I think that we talk about kind of different generations. We now have more generations in the workforce than we've ever had before.
Mhm.
And as a manager, there are different nuances to coaching those kind of different generations.
Mhm.
And once we help managers understand it's an expectation we have of them and we give them the skills to be able to do it, I think they're the two pieces that are missing right now. Because I think a lot of organizations believe that the employee should own their own career.
Mhm.
And I think it's short-sighted because careers are much more transient now than they used to be.
Yeah.
You don't go to an organization and stay there for 25
Right.
years, right?
Yeah.
But you might come back, right?
Yep.
You may leave, go off, get more experience and come back. And so how you were treated there in the kind of first part will influence how you talk about that organization, whether you consider it to be, another option later in your career, that kind of
Certainly.
thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you know, I appreciate the shout out to my book. As you know, I published a new book last year on building your personal brand, and I see a lot of opportunity for leaders
Yeah.
to get more clarity on what their brand is, what they stand for, and then using that to attract and retain talent and
Hmm.
communicate and build trust. How have you seen that play out with the leaders that you've worked with?
Yeah, this is a super interesting one because if we look at Gallup's state of the workplace, they talk about managers being accountable or responsible. They influence 70% of employee engagement, and engaged employees we know this, they're more productive, they drive more profitability than non-engaged employees, and I think that there was a statistic that came out of Gallup last year that was 42% of people who left their job in the last 12 months said that their manager could have done something to make them stay.
Mm.
And I think that this idea that as an employee, I know my manager, I know what they stand for, and I'm super clear what I'm going to get, whether that's something I want or not, having the clarity is enough to be able to make a decision as an employee as to, whether I stay at this organization or not. And, there's this constant thing, the adage that we talk about, that people don't leave bad companies, they leave bad managers.
Mhm.
And I often think that when they're leaving a bad manager, it's because that manager doesn't know how to manage or lead people in a way that is true to themselves, that is true to kind of who they are.
Yeah.
And it's a reason why when we run leadership development programs with kind of senior leaders or high potentials, that we focus on their brand. Like, who do you want to be as a leader in this organization? And I think we miss a trick when we don't do it. You know, you and I talked earlier about when people are moving from an individual contributor to a manager. I think when we don't do that work there, we do the new manager or the first time manager a disservice, because if they understood that from the start and had been thinking about it, it will impact how they behave. It'll impact how they interact with their team.
Yeah, absolutely. So most of our listeners work in talent development. They get involved in leadership development. You've been in those roles. Now you're working with people in those space. What else do talent development, learning and development professionals need to be thinking about in terms of developing their leaders or building better managers, as you call it?
I love this question. And I don't know that I'm going to have anything here that our listeners aren't already thinking about. But I think there is a focus that we need to lean into when we're thinking about senior leaders and executives in the organization. And that is helping them to understand and get closer to what the day-to-day experience of working at that organization is like. The disconnect that I see often between an executive team or a senior leadership team and what it feels like to be working on the sales floor or working on the manufacturing floor is so stark that when the executive team and the senior leadership team is making decisions, if they aren't close enough to what that employee experience is, it can have huge consequences to what it feels like to work at their organization, which impacts business profitability, impacts the consumer or the user experience. So that's kind of one piece. I think, you know, there's a widening gap there in a lot of organizations where they, you know, the kind of senior leadership is not clear on what it feels like to be an employee in this organization. That's kind of one piece. Yeah. And then I think the second is around expectations and getting super clear on what the expectations are that you hold of your leaders, of your people managers. And if they have shifted since, you know, the last time you did this, it is totally fine to say, hey, the world has shifted, our organization has shifted, we're constantly moving, and here's the expectations that we have of you now. We talked right at the start about Project Oxygen at Google. You know, we realized when I was at Google, we realized that no longer held true completely. And so what does it look like now? And I think we have to keep doing that as the kind of landscape of doing work in this world that we're currently living in. I think we have to keep adjusting what our expectations are, because otherwise that kind of tension between a manager and their team just kind of creates friction, because there's an expectation that's held of them. Yeah.
Things are changing so much. So getting clear on expectations, the strategy, what we want to accomplish, and then what is actually the right approach to accomplishing those goals and developing our leaders so that we can be more successful as an organization.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Vic, this has been great. I love digging into all of the amazing experience you have and the work that you're doing today to build better leaders and help organizations develop leaders. For anybody listening that wants to get in touch with you or learn more about the work that you're doing, where's the best place for them to go?
Oh, I love that. So you can find me on LinkedIn as Vic Smith. You could email me at hello@whistlesmith.co, or you can check out the Whistlesmith website, and there's lots of places in there to reach out and connect.
Love it. Well, yeah, make sure you go connect with Vic on LinkedIn. And if you're not connected with me on LinkedIn,
come on, what are you doing? Yeah.
Come on. Come check it out, and let's develop and build better leaders in 2026. Vic, thank you again for coming on. Lovely talking with you. I look forward to keeping in touch and talking more in the future.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate spending this time with you. It's been awesome. Thank you.